Welcome in and welcome back. We are here for episode 4 of Ask Adrian Anything. And today's question comes to us from Miriam, who asks, what are 5 movies you would say influenced your outlook in some way? I think that this is a question which garners nuance in the answer. I think that it's a question which says there is more to changing one's outlook than is a one-faceted question. And I'm going to start this question's answer with Unbreakable by M. Night Shyamalan. Unbreakable by M. Night Shyamalan came out in 1999, I believe. And it could have been replaced on this list by Blade, which came out in 1998, both of which were movies that took the comic book genre into a serious consideration rather than the sort of camp approach which had been previously applied to this medium as it was adapted to film, oftentimes as it appeared in print, and up to that time, as far as I know, always when it had appeared on television, outside, ironically, of cartoons. For example, the X-Men cartoon of the early to mid 90s took that subject matter very seriously, much more seriously than, say, the Adventures of Lois and Clark, of which I was also a fan at the time. Unbreakable, the M. Night Shyamalan movie, the M. Night Shyamalan masterpiece, I dare say, I think is M. Night Shyamalan's best movie. I think is Bruce Willis's best movie. And maybe even Samuel L. Jackson's best movie. I think that this movie, it was severely underrated as it came out in theaters. But I think it was also underrated afterwards when it was building its legacy largely as a cult hit. It was nowhere near as successful as The Sixth Sense. I don't believe it was anywhere near as successful as Signs, which was the M. Night Shyamalan movie which came after Unbreakable. And it is very, very slow. It's a very, very slow movie, but it is a movie that goes into the depths of comic book lore, what superheroes are, what supervillains are, what makes them and drives them, whether there is a type of mythological / religious use for these characters and stories, and goes into character building to an extreme extent. And yes, there is the M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end, but it is not cheesy. It is not cheesy in the way that, what was it? The Village, or the M. Night Shyamalan movie that came after that. Those twists were cheesy. This twist served the story, but was not self-serving in that way. Personally, it taught me a great deal about tone. I was a young and aspiring writer when it came out, and it taught me not only about tone and character, it also taught me about the ability to take a theme and fold it in on itself. And yes, that is accomplished fairly ham-fistedly in this movie, with all of the self-referencing comic book movie tropes and stereotypes. But in its ham-fisted manner, it is not cheesy. And when it is ham-fisted but not cheesy, these are the ways that something can be illustrated to a person who does not quite fully understand those facets. And for me, at the time, it not having any type of advanced thought process on the matter. It was just bold enough that I was able to sort of wriggle my fingers behind it and tear off chunk by chunk of understanding some of those things. Number two, the assassination of Jesse James by that coward Robert Ford. It is an Andrew Dominic film from 2007, starring Brad Pitt as Jesse James, but also Sam Rockwell and Casey Affleck turn in masterful performances in this movie. This movie was important to me because I found it during a time where I was struggling with my writerhood. I found it damn near brand new. I think I Redboxed it at first, and it would have been one of the marquee names on the Redbox at the time. Otherwise, I never would have noticed it. But I found it during a time I was suffering with depression. I'll just put it out that way. And whether or not writing was necessary or worth pursuing or worth doing at all, whether anything was worth doing at all. And in this movie, that is something with which Brad Pitt's Jesse James character struggles, and struggles in a very visual way. And it was something with which I identified, which obviously drew me into the film. But being drawn into the film, the assassination of Jesse James by that coward Robert Ford is the most beautiful film I have ever seen. The most gorgeous film I have ever watched in my life. Picturesque, every scene looks like a painting. Like Norman Rockwell and Georgia O'Keeffe had a baby. That's how these stills look. If you've never seen the movie, it's definitely worth seeking out, and it is definitely worth owning. It really is. But it was the aesthetic. I hate to use such a hipster term, but the aesthetic of this movie is so engrossing that when I was struggling for some purchase on what it meant to communicate beauty, what it meant to be a writer, what it meant to struggle with things in the way that the character does in this movie, it showed me that the aesthetic of this movie showed me that yes, it is worth struggling. Yes, sometimes the melancholy, sometimes the dark can be gorgeous. And when the melancholy and the dark are gorgeous, it sends a specific tone to the audience, to the recipient of this art. And that is that even the struggles are worth it. It is I don't even know the words really to communicate it. It is a full type of feeling. And it's something that really made it all right for me for a little while. Really got me through a little while. And that is perhaps embarrassing to admit. But it's absolutely true. And it's something that added context for me at the time. So Jesse James was a Missouri boy. Jesse James was not only an outlaw, not only a bad guy, but an anti-hero. Jesse James was someone with which many people identified at the time. And contrasting that persona with the actual struggles of the person, which I also read a biography of Jesse James around the same time. It's not just a movie, it's not just a fictionalized version of that character. That's real. That really happened with the guy. It was stunning for me. And when you think about Jesse James, this is someone, there have been movies about Jesse James. What are movies? Movies are the American art form, often credited as the American art form, the most American way of storytelling that there is. Um, Jesse James is about as an American a character as there is. There have been movies about Jesse James since the oldest I could find was 1939. 1939 is also the year that Gone with the Wind came out. Jesse James is that large a portion of the American psyche. Jesse James was a cult hero while Jesse James was still alive. So to see him contrasted on screen, Casey Affleck's character in that movie is obsessed with the cult hero that is Jesse James. Jesse James is a little obsessed with the cult hero that was Jesse James. And to see both of them acknowledge that fiction is something that is a type of irony that is very hard to pull off, and this movie does it gorgeously. Number 3, since I'm using the term irony, I'll tell this story. Number 3 is Radio Flyer. A 1992 Richard Donner film that stars Elijah Wood. I think that... So I've taken note of after talking to a lot of people, and talking to people, not my favorite thing, talking to a lot of people. And for them, there is somewhere in adolescence a movie, a film, by which they were able to recognize they were wasting a great deal of time. For me, that was Radio Flyer. And what I mean by this is that I think when you're a child, if there's a movie on, you're along for the ride. You might not like it. You might not like the movie. But when you're watching it, you're along for the ride. Suspension of disbelief is automatic, I think, for many children. For most children. For any child that I was. And somewhere in adolescence, there's a movie by which someone was able to tell, A, they were wasting time, B, they were wasting time because it's not a good movie, but C, they were still watching. For me, that film was Radio Flyer. I have no idea to this day what Radio Flyer is about. I cannot tell you a single line from the movie. I cannot remember a single scene from the movie. I only sort of remember the fact that Elijah Wood was in it. There was a summer when my little sister and I watched this movie mindlessly almost every night. And neither of us fucking liked it. And I think it is an ironic schism that happens for us somewhere in adolescence, by which we are able to tell, through which we are able to tell, I'm stuck on this by which, through which we are able to tell the difference between enjoying something and something being good. I think when we're children, a lot of the times we see like and don't like, but we don't see good or no good. That is why we are stuck in phrases like that sucks. That sucks means I don't like it. There's no nuance there. I don't like it. So when we're able to put further, something might be bad, but I like it. There's a schism there. For example, think back to the films your father liked. You probably didn't. And you didn't have complex reasonings on why. You just didn't like them. I don't like those Clint Eastwood films. That's what my father watches. You couldn't say why. You couldn't say that it was because the character doesn't evolve during the script. He just stays the same. And while that might be the point of a Clint Eastwood film, it's not something I enjoy partaking in. I like my comic books where the hero evolves during those 15 pages. During that summer where I was watching this film, I realized there's a difference between liking something and something being good, disliking something and something being bad. Doesn't mean that I stopped watching the film. It just meant that there was I was watching it, realizing I didn't like it, and realizing why. To this day, I can't tell you why, but that's how it was. And my little sister and I will still joke about that. We will still send each other pictures of the Radio Flyer movie poster, or stills from the radio. I could recognize any still from the movie probably. I can't tell you what the hell the movie's about. It's weird the way your mind digests and expels those things. But what you hang on to. Number 4, Sphere. The 1998 movie from Barry Levinson, starring Dustin Hoffman. This is the same movie, or this is the same director that directed Rain Man, that directed all sorts of movies from the mid 80s to late 90s that you would recognize. And this movie absolutely sucks. It's terrible, miserable, awful. Somewhere in my middle school years, I fell in love with Michael Crichton. I read Eaters of the Dead, I read Jurassic Park, I read Sphere, I read The Andromeda Strain, at least one other book from Michael Crichton. Just fell in love with him. I don't know why. I could never read Congo. I don't know why I could never read Congo, but I could never get into it. Which tore me apart because I loved Tim Curry. And he was Herbert Homolka in the Congo film. I can't remember exactly what the character's name was. But I wanted to read the book and never couldn't get into it. I loved Sphere. Sphere was my favorite movie. So the weird thing about Michael Crichton is, and the absolutely enrapturing thing about Michael Crichton, is that he took two elements that you would never put together and just sort of smashed them together. He took dinosaurs and cloning. Who would ever think to put dinosaurs and cloning in the same story? Not me, that's for sure. But he melded them together and made something wonderful with it. In Sphere, two of the elements that he took were time travel and religion. Time travel and religion? What? And he smashed them together, and he made something that was, to middle school Adrian, an absolute revelation. Which centers around, they find a spaceship at the bottom of the ocean. Absolutely cutting technology beyond anything that we could ever imagine. They can tell that just from the outside of the ship, I think. But it's buried in coral reef. Coral reef that takes X number of... So basically, that thing has been there for thousands of years. In the book... So, I mean, just put yourself in middle school you mindset. That's amazing, right? A spaceship at the bottom of the ocean that's been there for thousands of years. Holy hell, what's going on? And I think they can tell something about it. It has English words on the outside or something. I don't remember, but they can tell it's a spaceship, but they think it's man-made. And it's been there for thousands of years. XYZ, whatever. Just an absolutely enrapturing story. And somewhere in the middle of this, Michael Crichton pulls into the fray religion. And it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. The movie does not do that. The movie is awful. The movie, even middle school me, who was I in middle school at the time? Yeah, 1998, I would have been in middle school. It would have been the 8th grade, I think. 7th or 8th. Couldn't finish the film. And that was important for me because it was the beginning of me being able to see the differences between text and movie, between something that is written for novel form and something that appears in Hollywood, for something that when I read this book, those characters did not look like that. But in the movie, they were Dustin Hoffman. I think Samuel L. Jackson was in that movie. But it was important for me because it showed me that there could, when you take even the same elements of something and you put them into less competent hands, which was the scriptwriter for that movie and the director, versus what I thought was the perfection of Michael Crichton. When you put those things in different hands and you roll those dice, they don't always come up the same numbers. And Barry Levinson? Yeah, Barry Levinson, Rain Man, that's a classic film. I can't remember any of the others that Barry Levinson did, but he definitely did others that I knew at the time. And, wow. It's not fair for me to say less competent hands, because obviously Dustin Hoffman, Samuel L. Jackson, Barry Levinson, very competent people. The movie sucked. Awful, miserable, terrible. And it was an absolute mindfuck for young me that those things could come out different. And at the time, I was so young that I thought anything that I was writing was the best that it could be. And just that difference of knowing that in less competent or differently competent hands, the same ideas can come out very differently, forced me to relook at my own writing, at the things that I had put on paper. And oftentimes on Strip Cover Lit, you will hear me say something like, I had to stop reading a book because I didn't have the tools at the time. I was able to recognize I didn't have the tools at the time. Or I stopped writing a project, normally novels. I am not a novelist. I can't write books. I don't know why. I'm terrible at it. I don't have the tools. I'm able to recognize I don't have the tools to tell this story as it is. That principle, the very idea of that, came from the Sphere movie. From recognizing that not all things are equal just because they're spit out. Just because they exist does not make them equal. So yeah, that was important for me, I think, on an artistic level. Number 5, American Pie Naked Mile. Number 6, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. In 1994, I think it's worth noting, The Mask came out, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective came out, and Dumb and Dumber came out. 1 year, 3 movies, a legend does make. The legend of Jim Carrey, as he existed in the mid-90s. And it's, just think about it this way. When you think of Jim Carrey, the Jim Carrey of Dumb and Dumber, The Mask, and Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, versus when you think of the Jim Carrey of Liar Liar. For me, those are very different people. They existed 3 years apart. 3 years apart, that's all, that's it. But little me worshipped at the altar of Jim Carrey. That slapstick humor was my thing at the time. Gorgeous. Beautiful. Perfection. That was who Jim Carrey was in the mid-90s. It must have been 96, maybe, that I think it was VH1 or MTV, did a show on Jim Carrey, and they showed Jim Carrey's life. Jim Carrey had a fucked up life. Jim Carrey's father, who he cited as the funniest person ever, who he cited as his idol, lost his safe job as, I believe, an accountant, and ended up as a janitor at a high school, something he did not enjoy. And something one might even say rude, but he still did. Why? Because his family needed to live. He was providing for his family. That's a big deal. And seeing the lessons that Jim Carrey took from that was inspiring. Jim Carrey said that one of the quotes from Jim Carrey is, he took this from his father, and I'm not going to get it perfectly, but it's something that I often go back to. It's possible to fail at the life you don't want. So you might as well try to fail at the life you do want. He noted that his father failed at the life he didn't want, being an accountant. And maybe the details are wrong, so don't write these down. Definitely look it up for yourself. His father failed at the life he didn't want, which was an accountant, when he absolutely could have been a stand-up comedian, Jim Carrey says. And if you can fail at the life you don't want, why pursue that? When failing at the life you do want would at least be in some way fulfilling, because at least you know the answer to whether or not you can do that thing, whether or not it is that you can do the thing that you want to do, that you think you were made for, that you think is your sole purpose in this life. So if you can fail at the 9 to 5, why not try rolling the dice and seeing if you fail at the thing it is you really want to do? Now, there is some gray area in the middle there where you can absolutely 9 to 5 at something that pays the bills and moonlight at what it is you want to do with your life. But I've always kept that with me. And that's why Jim Carrey was so primed to gamble on what it was he wanted to do. Stand-up comedy and acting, XYZ. And there's the very famous story of Jim Carrey writing himself a check. I think this was before the In Living Color years, when it was very obvious he was gambling on himself, writing himself a check for $25 million and tucking it into his wallet, postmarked by 1993 or something. Not postmarked, but dated 1993 or something. And he beat the date for having $25 million in his bank account by like 6 months. And I've just always found that utterly inspiring and something that was, look, whether or not you like Jim Carrey, whether or not you appreciate that humor, he did it. Whether or not he's gone crazy in the years since, at that time, he had done that thing. And it was, so at the time when whatever that special was, wherever that special came out, whatever channel it was on, it was a swift kick in my ass that you've got to go out and you've got to try. You have to gamble. You have to roll those dice. Safety is not the primary thing. Effort is. So put out that effort. And that is something that stuck with me. If you have a question for the next episode of Ask Adrian Anything, be sure to leave it in the comments below. I don't want to run out of questions. I want to keep doing this. So anything at all that you want to ask, be sure to leave it down there. And you can find me on Twitter at Adrian Anyway, on Instagram at _Adrian_Fort_, or on Twitter at StripCover, or on Instagram at StripCoverLit.